Welcome back to the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm Brent, and I'm joined by my co-host, Ann-Margaret. Hi, Ann-Margaret.
Hi.
Today, we are going to be talking about drought management with our EAA General Manager, Roland Ruiz. Hi, Roland. Welcome.
Hey there. How are y'all?
Doing great. Thanks for being here today.
Good.
So we're talking about the drought today because, as many of our listeners may know, Texas is in a exceptional drought. We've gone several months now without significant rainfall, and we're far below average, resulting in some drought conditions here locally, including some effects on our aquifer. So, Roland, maybe you could give us a little background about our current state of the aquifer here, and about our drought response, our critical period management, and what all goes into protecting the aquifer from drought like this.
Sure, and it's interesting that every time we get into drought, there's a lot of questions about what we should or shouldn't do, and I like to put it in historical context because the mere reality is that we exist because of drought. And when I say drought, we go back to the historic drought of the 1950s, which is the drought of record, and that's when the state of Texas really started to thinking seriously about what to do about drought, and you saw this growth in groundwater conservation districts around the state. You saw the EUWD, our predecessor organization, the Edwards Underground Water District, formed, and that's what we grew out of, was that historic drought. And so here we are again in drought, and I think if you compare this drought to past droughts in history since the 1950s, I think the silver lining to it all is that we have immensely more tools at our disposal now than we did in previous decades about how to manage ourselves through a drought. And for us, the key tool, of course, is our permitting system that we've had in place since 1996, since the creation of the EA, and we started implementing that permitting system. And then we've added to that critical period management planning, drought restrictions, if you will, that curtail use as the drought worsens and aquifer levels and spring flows start to decline to certain trigger points. So all that said, we find ourselves in the throes of this drought. We find ourselves in stage 3 of that critical period management plan. That means that everyone across the region who has an Edwards permit and is withdrawing from the aquifer is required to cut back their use to 35% of their authorized permit. And we're working with them, as we always do, to make sure that they understand what the rules mean to them, what they can and can't do, what they should do. And for the most part, the region has learned how to be compliant with those conservation practices. And I think the hard work that we've done actually happens when we're not in drought, through educating our permit holders, educating the public about what it means for the aquifer levels to be in decline. I often point to the fact that in this part of the state, aquifer levels are part of their daily weather forecasts, their daily weather reports. So people are very much in tune with what's happening with the aquifer, and I think that helps us in times of drought because the people understand that, hey, things are not only dry, but they're impacting our water resources, namely the Edwards, and they're really concerned about what they can do. And so I think it has heightened the conservation ethic across the region, and that's good for us. And so all we're doing is managing all those tools in the toolbox and putting them to use the best that we can, knowing that this is kind of what we were built for, was for managing through droughts and getting us to the next rain.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned several topics I wanted to talk about. First of all is how in tune residents here are with what's going on with the aquifer. You mentioned they all hear about it. It's actually on the weather reports on the nightly news, which I think is unique to any aquifer I've ever heard of. And so folks know that we are definitely below normal, and they have restrictions like watering restrictions, how often they can water their lawns and wash cars and things like that. But that's all in response to our cutbacks on water purveyors, right?
Correct. You know, I use this analogy here of late. When you look at the regulatory schematic of how this groundwater is regulated, and I use the analogy of a totem pole, and we're at the top of the totem pole, and we determine based on aquifer conditions when we go into a various stage of cutback, and we then communicate that to the regulated community permit holders. in particular, in this case, the municipal providers across the region that have customers, they then take what we tell them, the regulation that we impose on them, and they determine how they're going to pass that on to the end user. So, for example, San Antonio Water System is the largest permit holder in the region. When we go from one stage to the other, as we're in the middle of a drought, and we notify SAWS that, hey, we are moving from stage 1 to stage 2, or whatever the case may be, they know then what that means to them. That means they have to cut back their Edwards use by some level of percentage use based on their annual permit. What they do then is they either pass it on to their end user by saying, we're going to limit your watering, outdoor watering, to so many days a week or so many times of day, whatever the case may be, by local ordinance, or in the combination thereof, they may start to reduce their Edwards use that goes to their customers, and they may start to deploy some of their other groundwater sources or surface water resources. And SAWS has the benefit of having a more expanded water inventory, if you will. Over the years, they've acquired other sources beyond the Edwards. They've diversified their water portfolio, if you will, for this very reason, that they can endure periods of drought without having to impose too drastically or draconian fashion on their end user. Now, there are other users across the region, other municipalities that don't have that luxury. They don't have those resources. And those users usually impose the cutbacks directly to their customers, to their citizens, by drought restrictions on watering and such. And those entities we work very, very closely with to make sure that their planning in between droughts is taken care of, and that they've secured enough water to withstand the cutbacks. And so I think that's also been an outgrowth of drought planning, is that there are smaller communities across the region, mid-sized municipalities, for example, and water purveyors that plan for drought, and they have what I would call more water than they need during a rainy season, but come a dry season, they need that water and they have it in place. So it's all about planning. And I think that perhaps is the best outcome that we've seen over our 25-year history of being in place as a regulatory agency, is that people are now have embraced the idea that they have to plan for their water use in times of plenty so that they have it in times of scarcity. And so that's an outgrowth of the EAA Act being implemented. And we can now kind of approach a drought with more certainty than we could have in the past. It's still painful. It's still difficult to manage, because various industries are really impacted by it, like the ag industry. And as this, when you have what we currently are experiencing this summer, with not only scarcity of rain, but record-breaking temperatures, heat, the evapotranspiration that you have, even water that you have and you put on your crops, for example, you just can't get water onto them fast enough. And so that's what we're hearing. And so it's a difficult time for people, but we're here to educate people and remind them of how to best use those conservation tools.
It's even impacting our recreational users, folks that depend on these hill country streams. Well, most of those streams are spring fed, and those springs are way down this year, resulting in no or low flows at many of our popular streams. So it's hitting, all different sectors of the economy.
And I know, Roland, you mentioned diverse, water from the municipalities and things. And one of the things I kind of wanted to talk about was aquifer storage and recovery. I know we say that a lot, and some of the municipalities themselves say that. Can you kind of explain to that what that is? Because I feel like it's, this saline bubble underground where you pump water into, essentially, right? And it just kind of saves it there as a reservoir.
Sure. Yeah. One of the leaders in aquifer storage and recovery is, in fact, SAWS. They've developed an aquifer storage and recovery project in South Bexar County. And what they've done is they've basically taken their Edwards water in times when we're not in drought. They've taken some of their Edwards permit and they've pumped water and stored it in the Carrizo-Wilcox Aquifer, which is a different aquifer from the Edwards. It's a sand aquifer. And they've kept that water stored there. And in times of drought like we're in right now, they can bring some of that water back and they use that water instead of pumping directly from the Edwards. So that's the beauty of an aquifer storage and recovery system. You store water that you don't need in times of plenty, and then you have it in times when you don't have rain and you need to tap into it. We also have seen and have cooperated with other entities across the region, like New Braunfels Utilities, for example, that are trying to develop an aquifer storage and recovery system that's a little bit different than the SAWS ASR. What MBU is doing is they're trying to develop an ASR in the deep Edwards where the water is saline. It's a denser type of environment, and the concept is that you could store fresh water in denser brackish or saline water, and then do the same thing that SAWS is doing. You're not storing it in a different aquifer, but you're storing it in a different part of the aquifer that acts differently than the fresh water. And right now it's a concept that they're testing and trying to perfect. And if that works, that would be great, because it gives another tool within the region that can be used during times of drought that can help kind of mitigate the impacts of drought on the Edwards, because people are getting creative and they're looking at ways to store water when they don't need it so that they have it there when they absolutely do need it. And that in a nutshell is the ASR concept. So it could be that over time in the years to come, ASR can be a viable concept for other entities across the region as we face the stresses of demand on our water resources through growth and development in the region, not just on the Edwards, because the Edwards is pretty much taken care of through our regulatory program, but there are other aquifers that are going to feel the pinch, if you will. And so the more that we can store water like that in creative ways and have it there when it's absolutely a necessity, then the better off we'll be as a region to ensure that the Edwards stays sustainable and all these other neighboring aquifers do the same.
Mm-hmm. And so now we know, drought management is an important topic. Is a current event that's going on right now. Like we talked about, the nightly news, news all across is talking about aquifer conditions. But can you note some of the other things our agency is doing to kind of improve quantity and quality of water in the Edwards Aquifer, manage, enhance, and protect, those types of things?
Sure. And one of the things that we're really focusing on right now, and I think we've talked about it on previous podcasts, and as we talk about the next iteration of our mission as an agency, we've called that our next generation, if you will. And we're focusing on what can we do on the recharge and contributing zone segments of the system, which basically serve as the watershed to the aquifer. What can we do on the land to make sure that more water stays on the land longer before it gets into the aquifer, thereby getting somewhat cleaned or purified before it gets to the streams and then ultimately into the aquifer, so that you're at least protecting water quality, if not improving it, and also maybe enhancing the quantity of it, because you're keeping water longer in the soils up in the hill country. And soil moisture helps then when the rain goes away, because the longer you can keep those soils wet, the better off you are than in times of dry, because your soil content is much healthier. And when it does rain, it doesn't just run off the land, but it percolates and stays there. So that's something we're doing. We're still always concerned about abandoned wells. We're concerned about wells that have been in existence and have gotten lost in the tracking system, if you will, or someone has been negligent in properly closing the well, because we know that all those wells are openings into the aquifer, into the water supply below, and left unattended or in a deteriorated state. That means that anything on the surface, or even from cross-contamination from other aquifers, can potentially get into that system and not be good for any of us. So part of that is identifying issues that already exist, but also proactively educating people on what it takes to make sure that you're taking care of your own water resource, because it is, everything we do on the surface potentially impacts what happens in the subsurface in this aquifer. So there's a certain stewardship, I think, that is important as we move forward and more people move into this region. The education process never ends. It's continual. And I think that's why the new Education Outreach Center that just opened up on the recharge zone is the right venue at the right time to kind of revisit our mission and redefine it for people and introduce people to it in a different way and invite them actually to be part of the mission, to take a personal responsibility in what it means to be to have an aquifer that's sustainable for them and for their kids and their grandkids for generations to come.
Mm-hmm.
Roland, I like the analogy that these programs and initiatives are like tools in a toolbox for us to protect the aquifer. The one thing that we can't control is when the rain will come and how much we'll get. But we are no strangers to drought here in Texas. You mentioned the drought of the 1950s, which we call the drought of record. That is the longest and most exceptional drought in our recorded history. So in the 1950s, apart from, this has been one bad year, that was a 10-year spread of drier than average years.
Wow, a whole
resulting
decade.
in a cessation of flow at Comal Springs completely for 6 months. So that was a really bad drought. And now we base our efforts on that experience, right? Protecting against, quote unquote, our worst case scenario.
Correct. That's been our benchmark, so to speak, from whence everything comes. And we've developed our programming, for example, around our habitat conservation plan, around modeling around that drought. If we see that drought happen again, do we have the tools in place to ensure that spring flows don't cease, that that we have continuous minimum spring flows? What that means is that the protected habitats of the species, the federally endangered species, are protected even through the worst of conditions. And that gives us the authorization to continue to use the Edwards for everyone's benefit and use. And if for whatever reason those measures don't hold up, we have a refugia in place, and a refugia is really nothing more than a place to propagate species and keep them and hold them if we need to reintegrate them into the natural environment should all things not go bad. And so that's also another part of the tool. We don't like to think about that because we'd like to think that all the tools will work and we will prevent worst case scenarios. But even if there is a worst case scenario, there should be some sense of security that we have taken care of the worst case scenario with the refugia.
A fail-safe.
A fail-safe,
Yeah.
correct. And it's I know that historically there's been this kind of debate or this feeling of, man versus species, man versus critter. And, I think we've worked real hard to overcome that and say it's not so much that. What's good for species that live in the springs is good for all of us who rely on the Edwards for our drinking water supply, for water for our irrigation and whatnot. So it's brought greater certainty to the region, and I think we see that through this drought. I think we saw that through the drought of 2011 and through 2014. That was a pretty severe drought in and of itself in intensity. It wasn't as long as the drought of record, but in intensity it started to look quite a lot like the historic drought. And we know then that the springs didn't go dry; they continued, and our programs kind of were put to the test and came through. So I'm hopeful and I'm confident that we're going to see the same with this drought.
Yeah, I was going to mention that period because it's in, folks that have been around here that long probably remember that summer of 2011 was the hottest and driest on record. So more intense than that 1950s drought. And this year is sort of looking like a 2011. We're on track to beat our 100-degree days. But in terms of duration, we have a ways to go to match even that more recent drought.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you could look to a year ago to 2021, and I think you could make the case that the drought, it really began then. Because if you remember 2021, we got rainfall earlier in the year when it was needed most. For example, when we have the highest demand on the Edwards, and it mitigated some of the demand. And so aquifer levels stayed pretty stable for the most part. And then it didn't rain towards the second part of the year. And we entered into 2022, I think, with a rain deficit, if memory serves correct. And we just haven't had much rain at all in 2022. And so we find ourselves in that deficit of rainfall. And when that happens, and then the heat comes as it has, it only makes things worse because the demand on the aquifer goes up. So fortunately, or hopefully, cooler weather's around the corner. If we get to September and October, maybe cooler temperatures will help mitigate some of the demand. And certainly we know that the demand for irrigation by the agricultural industry will subside with the harvest of cotton. Cotton is one of the crops that goes beyond the normal growing season for corn, and I think cotton probably has another 3 to 4 weeks left of irrigation to go before they start harvesting that.
Mm-hmm.
So then maybe we'll see like aquifer levels kind of like stabilize a little bit more.
I hope so. We really need a couple of things, not just rain, lots of rain, but also cooler temperatures helps. And so if we could turn the tide that way, and I say, we really can't control that. That's nature.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's up to nature doing that. But in any case, I think getting through the hottest time of the year, the July-August time frame certainly is critical. And if we can get to September and the fall, generally speaking, things historically start to look a little better, and you start to feel a little better at least about it all.
Yes. And kind of going back to what we talked about, or what you mentioned earlier about educating the public and people become educated on the Edwards Aquifer, I think it's important to note that our agency has been around for 25 plus years, and in order to appreciate something, you have to understand it. So our Education Outreach Center is a good tool to have, interactive exhibits and displays that people can learn about the Edwards Aquifer, learn about drought management, that field research park, those land management techniques, abandoned wells, and all those types of things. Even the species, we'll have some aquariums that currently they feature non-native and native species in the San Marcos and Comal Springs, but they will feature the Texas blind salamanders and the fountain darters, which are endangered species that live in the aquifer. So I think that as a resource that people can use to understand why it's important to probably, conserve water and protect the Edwards Aquifer, I think that is an important piece of the puzzle, is getting those people to become educated on what the aquifer and how important it is.
Absolutely, and I think that what the Education Outreach Center does is that it makes it real for people. It's not just a concept. It's not even just a PowerPoint presentation, but there's some real hands-on type of learning that can occur there, and it makes it puts it in perspective. Even with such things as the demonstration of what a good well is and what a bad well is, that helps you understand that it's like a straw into the aquifer, and if you think about a straw that has holes in it, it's not very functional, and it doesn't really do its job. So there's all those little things, and even the ability to understand the natural water cycle and how it all works, in particular for this system. How we don't exist in a vacuum. We don't exist in isolation here in this part of Texas. That there's a greater linkage between the natural cycles of the environment and water. That what happens here is only an outgrowth of something that may happen in the Gulf or out in the Atlantic Ocean, for example. So all that kind of helps put things in perspective and makes you think about the fact that we are not just citizens of this little part of Texas, but we're citizens of a more global environment that potentially has an impact on us and we on it.
Yeah, I was just going to add that obviously most citizens in this region are not EAA permit holders. They're not Edwards Aquifer permit holders. But all of us can help conserve water and help this area be protected from drought. So there are ways to save water in the home. There's ways to save water elsewhere, and we can all be a part of the solution.
Correct.
Well, Roland, we really appreciate your time, and thanks for joining us today. And we may talk again as we see the conditions move along here, and hopefully we'll get some rain and pull out of this drought, and we can talk again about at that time.
Sounds good. Glad to be with y'all.
Thanks,
Always
Roland.
good to be with y'all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast.
Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.